Cologne Cathedral, the largest Gothic church in Northern Europe. August 1248. An archbishop lays a foundation stone for a building that will take 632 years to complete. Twin spires reaching 157 meters. 10,000 square meters of stained glass. A golden shrine holding what believers claim are the bones of the three wise men, stolen from Milan as spoils of war. The vision was eternal. The money was not. By 1473, construction stopped. A wooden crane froze atop the unfinished tower and stayed there for 400 years. The greatest Gothic project ever attempted became Europe's most magnificent ruin. Then came the resurrection. Romantic nationalists rediscovered the original medieval plans, and on October 15th, 1880, the completed cathedral became the tallest building in the world. War brought another turn. 262 Allied bombing raids, 14 direct hits. The city flattened, 95% destroyed. And somehow, the cathedral still standing. 30,000 euros per day just to keep the stones from crumbling. As the people of Cologne say, when the cathedral is finished, the world will end. Who paid for this dream? Workers who built it, pilgrims who walked hundreds of miles to see it, nationalists who finished it, and 6 million visitors per year who keep it alive. Can faith build something that outlasts empires? And what happens when bombs fall on a house of God? If you enjoy deep investigations into Gothic architecture and the faith that built it, please like, subscribe, and tell me in the comments which cathedral to explore next. Your support makes these detailed stories possible. Thank you for being here. Let us begin. August 1164. A procession moves slowly through the heat of a European summer. Dust rises from the road. Soldiers march in formation. Behind them, a wagon carries something more precious than gold, more dangerous than weapons. Inside a wooden chest wrapped in cloth and guarded by armed men lie bones, old bones, ancient bones, bones that will change the fate of a city and inspire a building that will take 632 years to complete. The man leading this procession is Reinald von Dassel, Archbishop of Cologne and Chancellor of the Holy Roman Empire. He has just returned from Italy, where his master, Emperor Frederick Barbarossa, crushed the rebellious city of Milan. The spoils of that conquest were many: gold, silver, treasures stripped from churches and palaces. But Reinald did not ask for gold. He asked for something far more valuable. He asked for relics. In the Basilica of Sant Eustorgio in Milan, there rested what believers claimed were the remains of the three wise men. The Magi, the kings who followed a star to Bethlehem and knelt before the infant Christ with gifts of gold, frankincense, and myrrh. For over 8 centuries, pilgrims had traveled to Milan to venerate these bones. They prayed beside the sarcophagus. They touched the stone with trembling hands. They believed that proximity to such sacred relics could heal the sick, forgive sins, and guarantee passage to heaven. Now those bones were on their way to Cologne. The journey took weeks. From Milan, the procession crossed the Alps through mountain passes still dangerous with bandits and weather. They descended into the German lands, following the great rivers northward. Word spread ahead of them. By the time Reinald approached the gates of Cologne, crowds had gathered. Thousands lined the roads. Church bells rang from every tower. The entire city seemed to hold its breath. On July 23rd, 1164, the relics entered Cologne. The archbishop carried them through streets decorated with flowers and banners. He brought them to the old cathedral, a Carolingian structure that had stood on the site for nearly 3 centuries. It was a respectable church, solid and serviceable, but it was not built for what was about to happen. The arrival of the three kings transformed Cologne overnight. What had been an important but regional church suddenly became one of the most significant pilgrimage destinations in all of Christendom. Only Rome, Jerusalem, and Santiago de Compostela could rival it. Pilgrims began arriving almost immediately. They came from across Germany, from France, from England, from the distant corners of Catholic Europe. They came on foot, walking for weeks or months. They came to see the bones. They came to touch the shrine. They came to pray. The old cathedral was overwhelmed. It had not been designed to handle such crowds. The building was too small, too dark, too cramped for the flood of humanity now streaming through its doors. And more importantly, it was not grand enough. A church that housed the relics of the three wise men, a church that attracted pilgrims from across the known world, needed to make a statement. It needed to declare the glory of God and the power of the church. It needed to reach toward heaven itself. Within 2 decades of the relics arriving, work began on a new shrine to house them. This was not a simple box. This was a masterpiece of medieval goldsmithing, a triple sarcophagus covered in gold and silver, decorated with precious stones and intricate enamel work, populated with tiny sculpted figures of prophets and apostles. Nicholas of Verdun, one of the greatest craftsmen of the age, began the work around 1180. It would take roughly 45 years to complete. The Shrine of the Three Kings remains one of the largest and most elaborate reliquaries ever created. It stands about 5 feet high, more than 6 feet long, shaped like a small basilica, with 2 lower sarcophagi and a third resting on top. The surfaces are covered with over 1,000 jewels and beads. 74 figures in high relief populate its panels, telling stories from the life of Christ, displaying the prophets who foretold his coming, honoring the kings who traveled to worship him. At the front, a removable panel allows the faithful to glimpse inside, to see the names inscribed there: Caspar, Melchior, Balthazar, the 3 kings. But even as the shrine took shape, it became clear that the old cathedral could not contain it. The building that had served Cologne for centuries was inadequate for this new reality. What the city needed was not a renovation or an expansion. What the city needed was something entirely new, something unprecedented, something that would match the significance of what it held. The decision to build a new cathedral was not made lightly. Such projects consumed generations. They bankrupted kingdoms. They required resources and expertise that most cities could never assemble. But Cologne was not most cities. It was one of the largest and wealthiest urban centers in medieval Europe. Its position on the Rhine made it a hub of trade. Its archbishop was a powerful figure in imperial politics. And now it possessed relics that made it a spiritual capital second to few places on earth. The timing was also significant. Across France, a new style of architecture was revolutionizing church construction. The old Romanesque style, with its thick walls, small windows, and heavy rounded arches, was giving way to something lighter, taller, more ambitious. The French called it simply the New Style. Later generations would call it Gothic. Pointed arches replaced rounded ones. Ribbed vaults distributed weight more efficiently. Flying buttresses transferred the thrust of stone ceilings to external supports, freeing the walls from their load-bearing duties. And with that, freedom came glass, vast expanses of glass, windows that climbed toward heaven and filled interiors with colored light. The great French cathedrals were rising one after another. Chartres had been begun in 1194, Reims in 1211, Amiens in 1220, each one taller than the last, each one reaching higher, each one demonstrating what was possible when faith and engineering joined hands. Cologne looked at what France was building and decided to surpass it. In 1248, the Archbishop of Cologne was Conrad von Hochstaden. He was a practical man and a political one. He understood that a new cathedral would serve multiple purposes. It would honor God and house the relics properly. It would attract more pilgrims and increase the wealth flowing into the city. It would demonstrate the power and prestige of his archbishopric. And it would stand as a monument that would outlast him, outlast his successors, outlast perhaps the empire itself. On August 15th, 1248, a Saturday, Conrad laid the foundation stone for the new cathedral. The date was chosen with care. August 15th is the feast of the Assumption of Mary, one of the most important days in the Catholic calendar. By beginning construction on this date, the archbishop was placing the entire project under divine protection. He was declaring that this building belonged to heaven. The man chosen to design and oversee construction was known as Master Gerhard. We know surprisingly little about him with certainty. Some records suggest he came from a family called von Ryle, possibly minor nobility with lands near Cologne. He may have been born around 1210 or 1215. He almost certainly studied the great French cathedrals, particularly Amiens, which would serve as the primary model for his design. But whether he actually worked in France or simply studied drawings and reports from travelers, we cannot say for certain. What we know is that Master Gerhard conceived something extraordinary. He did not simply copy Amiens. He studied it, understood its principles, and then pushed further. His design called for a church that would be 144 meters long and 86 meters wide, shaped like a Latin cross as Gothic tradition demanded. The nave would rise nearly 44 meters from floor to vault, making it one of the tallest in the world. Twin towers at the western end would climb higher still, perhaps 150 meters or more, topped with delicate spires of open stonework. The interior would follow the French model, but exceed it, a tall arcade of pointed arches along the ground level. Above it, a narrow triforium gallery with delicate tracery. Higher still, vast clear-story windows flooding the space with light. The choir at the eastern end would feature an ambulatory, allowing pilgrims to walk around behind the high altar, where the shrine of the three kings would rest. 7 radiating chapels would bloom from this ambulatory like petals from a flower. And everywhere there would be glass. More than 10,000 square meters of windows when complete. The largest window area of any church in the world. Medieval builders understood that light was sacred. God was light. Heaven was light. A church filled with colored light was a church that brought worshippers closer to the divine. Master Gerhard drew his plans on parchment, detailed elevations showing exactly how each section should be built. These drawings were not mere sketches. They were precise architectural documents that would guide generations of builders who would never meet him. Remarkably, some of these original plans survived. They would prove crucial 6 centuries later, when the cathedral was finally completed according to medieval intentions. Construction began at the eastern end, with the choir. This was standard practice for medieval cathedrals. The choir was the liturgical heart of the building, the space where clergy gathered for daily services. By building it first, the church could function even while the rest of the structure slowly rose around it. The old Carolingian cathedral remained in use, its western portions serving the faithful while workers swarmed over the new choir rising just to the east. The work was immense. The foundations had to be dug deep into the earth, reaching solid ground that could support hundreds of thousands of tons of stone. Basalt blocks were laid first, bound together with tuff and mortar. In the archaeological zone beneath the modern cathedral, visitors can still see these foundations, can still trace where medieval builders encountered the remains of earlier structures and worked around them, preserving by accident an archaeological record that would fascinate future generations. Above ground, the walls began to climb. Limestone blocks were cut at quarries, some as far away as the Drachenfels mountain along the Rhine. Teams of workers loaded the stone onto boats and floated it downstream to Cologne. At the construction site, stonemasons shaped each block according to Master Gerhard's specifications. Cranes, powered by men walking inside great wooden wheels, hoisted the finished pieces into place. The medieval crane of Cologne Cathedral would become legendary, a wooden treadwheel device standing roughly 25 meters tall, capable of lifting stones weighing up to 2 tons. Year after year, the choir rose higher. Gerhard died around 1260. his great work barely begun. His assistant Arnold took over, continuing to follow the master's plans. The work proceeded steadily through the 1270s, the 1280s, the 1290s. Stained glass windows were commissioned and installed, flooding the interior with color. The choir stalls were carved from oak between 1308 and 1311, 84 seats with misericords, depicting everything from mythical beasts to scenes of everyday medieval life. Finally, in 1322, 74 years after the foundation stone was laid, the choir was consecrated. Archbishop Heinrich von Wierneberg presided over the ceremony. The space was sealed off from the construction site with a temporary wall so that services could begin while work continued on the nave and towers. The Shrine of the Three Kings was moved into its new home, elevated behind the high altar where pilgrims could approach it through the ambulatory. The choir of Cologne Cathedral stood complete. It was magnificent. It was unprecedented. It demonstrated what faith and skill and endless resources could achieve. And it was barely a quarter of what Master Gerhard had envisioned. The question that would haunt the next 5 centuries was simple. Could the rest of the cathedral ever be finished? The scale was almost incomprehensible. The cost was staggering. The technical challenges were immense, and the world was changing in ways that would make such projects increasingly difficult to sustain. But on that day in 1322, as incense filled the new choir and voices lifted in song, none of that mattered. The dream born of bones had taken physical form. The relics of the Three Kings rested in a space worthy of their significance. And the greatest Gothic cathedral in Northern Europe had begun its slow march toward completion, a march that would take 6 more centuries and transform everything about who controlled it, who paid for it, and what it meant. The bones that Reinhold von Dassel carried from Milan had started something that no one could have imagined. They had started a building project that would span the rise and fall of empires, survive wars and revolutions, outlast the medieval world that conceived it, and still stand unfinished when the Romantics of the 19th century decided to pick up where their ancestors had left off. The dream born of bones was just beginning. Chapter 2. A Foundation Stone in August. The day they chose to begin was not random. August 15th, 1248, the Feast of the Assumption, when Catholics celebrate Mary being taken bodily into heaven. Archbishop Conrad von Hochstaden understood the power of symbolism. By laying the foundation stone on this most sacred day, he was making a statement that would echo through centuries. This cathedral would reach toward heaven just as Mary had ascended to it. The site itself already held layers of sacred history. Christians had worshipped on this spot since the 4th century, perhaps earlier. Maternus, the first bishop of Cologne, may have gathered his small community here around 313, meeting not in a purpose-built church, but in a converted Roman house. After the empire fell and new kingdoms rose from its ashes, the Merovingian rulers of Cologne constructed an episcopal church on the site in the 6th century. This gave way to the Carolingian Cathedral, a building called the Hildebold Cathedral, consecrated in 873, and enlarged several times over the following centuries. When the relics of the Three Kings arrived in 1164, the Hildebold Cathedral was already showing its age. It was respectable but outdated, built in the Romanesque style with thick walls and small windows and heavy round arches. The influx of pilgrims strained its capacity. More importantly, its aesthetic no longer matched the ambitions of its clergy. Across France, the new Gothic style was transforming what churches could be. Cologne wanted something modern. Cologne wanted something extraordinary. In 1248, the decision was made to demolish the old cathedral and build a new. But medieval builders were practical men. They would not tear down the entire structure at once and leave the congregation without a place to worship. Instead, they would build the new cathedral in stages, demolishing sections of the old building only as new sections became available for use. The process would take generations, but it would ensure continuity of worship throughout. The plan that Master Gerhard developed was breathtaking in its ambition. He had clearly studied the great French cathedrals, particularly Amiens, which had been under construction since 1220 and represented the cutting edge of Gothic design. Amiens offered a model for organizing space, for distributing weight, for reaching unprecedented heights while maintaining structural stability. But Gerhard did not simply copy. He adapted and improved, creating a design that would push Gothic architecture to its limits. The ground plan followed tradition, a Latin cross shape with a long nave running east to west, crossed by a shorter transept running north to south. At the eastern end, the choir where clergy would gather for services, and where the high altar and shrine would rest. Around the choir, an ambulatory allowing circulation, with 7 radiating chapels sprouting from it like fingers from a hand. The design was French in inspiration, but Germanic in execution, incorporating details and proportions that distinguished it from its models. The dimensions were staggering. The interior length would stretch 144.5 meters. The width across the transept would reach 86.25 meters. The nave would rise 43.5 meters from floor to vault, with side aisles climbing to nearly 20 meters. The western facade would be dominated by twin towers, reaching 157 meters, making them the tallest structures in the world when completed. To achieve these heights, Gerhard relied on the full toolkit of Gothic engineering. Pointed arches distributed weight more efficiently than rounded ones, channeling forces downward rather than outward. Ribbed vaults reduced the amount of stone needed while maintaining strength, their intersecting ribs forming a skeletal framework that supported thin panels of fill between them. Flying buttresses transferred the outward thrust of the high vaults to massive piers standing clear of the building, allowing the walls themselves to become thin screens of glass rather than load-bearing masses. The interior would be organized in 3 horizontal bands, following the French formula. At ground level, a tall arcade of pointed arches opening into the side aisles. Above this, a narrow triforium gallery with delicate tracery, originally intended to provide a covered walkway, but also serving to reduce the apparent weight of the upper walls. Higher still, the clear story, with its vast windows flooding the space with colored light. Each element worked together, the proportions carefully calculated to create an effect of soaring verticality that would lift the eyes and spirits of worshippers toward heaven. Construction began at the eastern end with the choir. This was standard practice. The choir was the liturgical heart of any cathedral, the space where the clergy gathered multiple times daily for the Opus Dei, the work of God. By completing the choir first, the building could begin functioning as a church, even while the rest slowly rose around it. The western end, with its great towers, could wait. The nave could wait. What mattered first was creating a home for the relics and a space for worship. The old Hildebold Cathedral was not entirely demolished at the start. Its western portions remained standing, provisionally restored after a fire, continuing to serve the congregation while the new choir rose to the east. Only after 1322, when the Gothic choir was consecrated and sealed with a temporary wall, would the old building begin to disappear. The foundation work was immense. Medieval builders understood that a structure of this scale needed to reach solid ground. Excavations went deep, and workers encountered the remains of earlier buildings, Roman structures, Merovingian foundations, fragments of the religious history they were building upon. Some of these earlier foundations were incorporated into the new work where possible. Others were demolished and cleared. The archaeological treasure beneath today's cathedral was preserved partly by accident, the medieval builders choosing to build around what they found rather than systematically removing it. For the foundations themselves, basalt blocks were laid in carefully planned courses. Basalt was hard and resistant to water, crucial for a structure that needed to stand for centuries. The blocks were bound with tuff and mortar, creating a solid base that could support the tremendous weight above. Modern archaeological excavations beneath the cathedral have revealed these foundations, showing the care and skill of 13th century builders, working with tools and techniques that had remained essentially unchanged since Roman times. Above ground, the walls began to rise. The stone came from multiple sources. Trachyte was quarried locally. Sandstone provided material for many structural elements, but the most distinctive stone came from further away. Limestone from the Drachenfels, a mountain along the Rhine southeast of Cologne, provided material for much of the exterior. This stone was loaded onto boats and floated downstream to the city, unloaded at the riverside and transported to the building site. The stonecutters worked with remarkable precision. Each block had to be shaped according to the architect's plans, its dimensions exact, its surfaces finished to specification. Mason's marks, small symbols carved into the stone, identified which craftsman had cut each piece, allowing for quality control and payment tracking. Some of these marks can still be seen on stones throughout the cathedral, silent signatures of medieval workers whose names have been lost to history. To lift the finished stones into place, workers relied on the crane. The medieval crane of Cologne Cathedral became one of the most famous machines of its age. It was a treadwheel crane, powered not by animals or wind or water, but by human muscle. Workers walked inside great wooden wheels, like hamsters in an exercise wheel, and their motion translated into lifting power through a system of ropes and pulleys. The crane could raise stones weighing up to 2 tons to heights of 25 meters or more. Installing the crane was itself a major engineering feat. As the walls rose higher, the crane had to rise with them, rebuilt and repositioned as construction progressed. By the time work halted in the late 15th century, a massive wooden crane sat atop the unfinished South Tower, visible for miles around, a symbol of ambition interrupted. That crane would remain in place for roughly 400 years, the most famous landmark of Cologne's skyline until the 19th century finally brought completion. The workforce was substantial. Skilled masons shaped the stone. Carpenters built scaffolding and forms for arches and vaults. Laborers hauled materials and operated the crane. Smiths forged tools and the iron that reinforced joints and held glass in place. Glaziers cut and assembled the stained glass windows. Artists and sculptors created the decorative elements, the statues and reliefs that populated the portals and niches. A medieval cathedral construction site was a small city unto itself, a community organized around a single overwhelming purpose. Master Gerhard oversaw this enterprise until his death around 1260. Legend has it that he died in a fall from the scaffolding, the victim of a wager with the devil gone wrong. The story goes that Gerhard bet he could complete the cathedral before the devil could construct a water pipe from Trier to Cologne. When he discovered the devil was about to win, he threw himself from the construction in despair. It is almost certainly myth, but it speaks to how medieval minds understood the scale of the ambition, so vast that only supernatural forces could explain both its conception and its challenges. After Gerhard came his assistant Arnold, who served as master builder until 1299. The work continued steadily. The choir walls rose higher. The flying buttresses reached out to support them. The windows went in one by one, the glass cut and painted and assembled in lead cames, filtering the German light into rainbows of color inside. By 1300, the choir was essentially complete in its structure. The final decorative elements took another 2 decades. The choir stalls, with their carved misericords, were finished between 1308 and 1311. The painted choir screens depicting scenes from the life of Christ and the Virgin went up between 1332 and 1340. The high altar with its enormous slab of black marble, believed to be the largest single altar stone in any Christian church, was installed in 1322 for the consecration, and finally, on September 27, 1322, Archbishop Heinrich von Wienerberg consecrated the choir. 74 years had passed since Konrad von Hochstaden laid the foundation stone. 3 generations of workers had given their labor to the project. Countless cartloads of stone had been hauled, cut, hoisted, and set in place. The cost had been enormous, funded by pilgrimage revenues, by donations from the faithful, by the wealth of one of Europe's richest cities. The completed choir was magnificent. The vaults soared nearly 44 meters overhead. The windows filled the space with light. The shrine of the 3 kings rested behind the high altar, elevated where pilgrims could approach it through the ambulatory, could walk around the eastern end of the building in a continuous circuit that brought them close to the relics without disrupting services in the choir proper. Visitors marveled at what they saw. The choir of Cologne Cathedral was unlike anything in Germany. It rivaled the great French cathedrals in height and exceeded them in certain details. The stained glass windows were among the largest surviving medieval glass in Europe. The sculptures on the choir pillars, 14 statues of Christ and the Apostles and Mary dating from around 1300, displayed a naturalism and emotional depth that pointed toward the Renaissance still 2 centuries away. But the choir was only the beginning. Master Gerhard had planned an entire cathedral, and what stood in 1322 was perhaps a quarter of that vision. The nave stretched westward only as foundations and intentions. The great towers existed only on parchment. The western facade, with its elaborate portals and soaring spires, remained a dream sketched in ink. Work continued after the consecration. In the mid-14th century, attention turned to the western end. Under Master Michael, construction began on the facade and towers. The foundations for the south tower were laid in 1360. The bells Pretiosa and Speciosa, still among the cathedral's most treasured, were cast in 1448 and 1449. By the late 1400s, the south tower had risen to its belfry level, complete except for its spire. And then something changed. The pace of construction slowed. The intensity that had driven the project for 2 centuries began to fade. By 1473, major construction work ceased. The last known cathedral architect, Johann Quenne van Frankenberg, is mentioned in records from 1491. After that, silence. Around 1500, the foundation stone for the North Tower was laid, but construction was already sputtering. By 1530, work had essentially stopped. The reasons were multiple. Money was always a challenge. The Protestant Reformation disrupted traditional funding sources and directed attention elsewhere. The 30 Years' War devastated Germany. Political and economic conditions made such vast projects impossible to sustain. The spirit of the age had changed. The medieval world that conceived the cathedral was giving way to a modern world with different priorities. What remained was extraordinary but incomplete. A magnificent choir standing beside the shell of an unfinished nave. A south tower rising to its belfry level but lacking its spire. A north tower barely begun, and crowning the south tower, clearly visible from miles away. The great wooden crane that had lifted the stones into place, frozen in position. A monument to ambition interrupted. The crane would stand for 400 years. Generations of Cologne residents would grow up seeing it against the sky, a reminder of what their ancestors had attempted and what they had failed to complete. Visitors remarked on it. Artists painted it. It became as much a symbol of the cathedral as the building itself, a promise unkept, a dream deferred. The foundation stone that Archbishop Conrad laid on August 15th, 1248, had started something that could not be stopped, but also could not be finished. Not by his generation, not by the 5 generations that followed. The Gothic dream would have to wait for a different age, different resources, different motivations to see it through to completion. But the stone was laid. The plan existed. The choir stood as proof of what was possible. And somewhere in archives and workshops, the medieval drawings survived, waiting for a future that would finally honor the ambitions of Master Gerhard. 632 years would pass from that August day to the moment when the cathedral was finally declared complete. 632 years of construction and neglect, of war and peace, of empires rising and falling. The foundation stone had started a journey that no one in 1248 could have imagined. A journey that would make Cologne Cathedral not just a building, but a symbol of human persistence, of faith that spans centuries, of dreams that refuse to die, even when the dreamers are long dead and the world has utterly changed around them. Chapter 3. The Choir of Light. Step inside the choir of Cologne Cathedral and look up. The vault seems to float, nearly 44 meters overhead, its ribs spreading like the branches of stone trees, meeting at the crown. Light pours through windows that climb higher than any you have seen, coloring the air itself with blue and red and gold. You are standing in what many scholars consider the most perfectly conceived Gothic interior in existence. You are standing in a space designed to make you feel the presence of God. The completion of the choir in 1322 marked the end of the first great phase of construction. It had taken 74 years from foundation stone to consecration, 3 generations of workers, incalculable resources. But what those generations achieved was nothing less than a revolution in stone. They created an interior that has never been surpassed, a space where engineering and art and faith fuse into something that transcends any single one of those elements. To understand what makes the choir extraordinary, you must understand the problem Gothic architects were trying to solve. Medieval Christians believed that God was light. Scripture said so. Christ himself declared that he was the light of the world. If God was light, then a church filled with light was a church filled with the divine presence. But light required windows, and windows required holes in walls, and holes in walls weakened the structure. The history of Gothic architecture is the history of making walls disappear while keeping roofs up. The solution came through a series of innovations that developed across France in the 12th century. Pointed arches channeled weight downward more efficiently than rounded ones. Ribbed vaults created skeletal frameworks that needed only thin fill between them. Flying buttresses transferred the outward thrust of those vaults to external piers, removing the structural burden from the walls entirely. With walls freed from their load-bearing duties, they could become screens, frameworks for glass. Cologne took these French innovations and pushed them as far as they would go. The clear-story windows in the choir are among the largest medieval windows surviving anywhere. More than 10,000 square feet of glass filled the eastern end of the building. When the sun shone through them, the interior glowed with color. When clouds moved overhead, the patterns shifted and changed. The effect was not static, but living, a constant play of light and shadow that medieval worshippers understood as the visible manifestation of divine presence. The windows themselves were masterpieces. The oldest surviving glass in the cathedral dates from around 1260, contemporary with the earliest construction. The great cycle of 14th century windows in the choir represents the largest intact medieval window program in Europe. These are not simple decorations. They are theological statements in glass, designed to be read and understood, to teach the faithful the stories of Scripture and the lives of saints. The famous Bible window sits in the central chapel of the ambulatory. Its panels depict scenes from the Old and New Testaments, arranged to show how the events of Christ's life fulfilled prophecies from Jewish Scripture. Medieval viewers would have read these windows like books, their eyes moving from panel to panel, absorbing the visual narrative. 95% of the glass in the choir windows is original, surviving 7 centuries of weather and war. The creation of such windows required extraordinary skill. glassmakers produced colored glass in furnaces, adding metallic oxides to molten silica. Cobalt made blue, manganese made purple, copper made green or red, depending on how it was handled. The molten glass was blown into cylinders, slit lengthwise, and flattened into sheets while still hot. Artists then cut these sheets into pieces, following full-scale drawings called cartoons, painting details onto the glass with a mixture of iron oxide and ground glass that would fuse permanently when fired in a kiln. The pieces were assembled in lead cames, H-shaped strips that held the glass while allowing for slight movement as the window expanded and contracted with temperature. Changes. The completed panels were installed in iron armatures set into the stonework. A single large window might contain thousands of individual pieces of glass, each one cut and painted and fired and fitted by hand. The interior of the choir was organized to maximize the impact of all this light. The floor was laid with patterned tiles. The walls were painted, though most of that paint has long since faded or been removed. The choir stalls along the sides provided seating for the clergy during the hours of the divine office, the cycle of prayers and psalms that structured the monastic day. Those choir stalls are themselves remarkable. Carved from oak between 1308 and 1311, they feature 84 misericords, small ledges on the underside of the hinged seats. When the seat was folded up, the misericord provided a narrow perch on which a standing monk could lean during long services. The carvings on these misericords depict a wild variety of subjects, from biblical scenes to mythical beasts to everyday activities like farming and drinking. They provide a window into the medieval imagination, a glimpse of what ordinary people found entertaining or instructive. The painted choir screens, completed between 1332 and 1340, enclosed the choir on its western side, separating the sacred space where clergy gathered from the nave where laypeople would eventually worship. These screens depicted scenes from the life of Christ and the Virgin Mary, painted in bright colors that have dimmed with age, but still show the quality of the original work. Above the high altar, elevated and visible from all around, rested the reason for the cathedral's existence. The Shrine of the Three Kings occupied a position of honor that allowed pilgrims to approach it through the ambulatory without disrupting services. They could walk around the eastern end of the building in a continuous circuit, coming close to the relics, praying before the golden shrine, touching the ironwork that protected it. The shrine itself had been in progress for decades before the choir was completed. Nicholas of Verdun began work around 1180, and the project continued for roughly 45 years. What he and his successors created was the largest reliquary in the Western world, a masterpiece of metalwork that combined gold and silver with precious stones, enamel, and sculptural figures. The structure takes the form of a small basilica, a church within a church. 2 sarcophagi rest side by side at the bottom, with a third perched on top of them. The lower sarcophagi hold the relics of the 3 kings. The upper one contains the bones of Felix and Nabor, early Christian martyrs. The entire structure measures roughly 5 feet high, over 6 feet long, and nearly 4 feet wide. The surfaces are covered with decoration. More than 74 figures in high relief populate the shrine, executed in silver gilt. Prophets and apostles and angels crowd the panels. Scenes from the life of Christ alternate with depictions of the Magi themselves. At the front, dominating the composition, the infant Christ sits on Mary's lap while the 3 kings present their gifts. It is the central image of the shrine, the reason for its existence, the moment that made these bones sacred. Over 1,000 jewels and gems were set into the metalwork. Some have been lost to theft or time, but hundreds remain, catching the candlelight that would have illuminated medieval services. The largest was a Ptolemy cameo, a classical gem depicting a ruler that dominated the front until it was stolen in 1574. Even without it, the shrine dazzles. It represents 45 years of labor by the finest craftsmen available, working with the most expensive materials imaginable. The pilgrims who came to Cologne came for this shrine. They had walked for weeks or months to stand before it. They believed that proximity to the relics could heal disease, forgive sin, ensure salvation. The Shrine of the Three Kings made Cologne one of the most important pilgrimage destinations in Christendom, rivaling Rome and Santiago de Compostela. The consecration in 1322 marked the moment when all of this came together. Archbishop Heinrich von Werneberg presided over ceremonies that filled the new choir with clergy and guests. Incense rose through the colored light, voices lifted in chants that had remained essentially unchanged for centuries. The shrine rested in its new home, finally housed in a space worthy of its significance. But the consecration also marked a recognition that the cathedral remained deeply incomplete. A temporary wall sealed the choir from the construction site to the west. Beyond that wall, work continued on the nave and the towers, but at a pace that suggested the original vision might never be realized. The church could function now. Services could be held. Pilgrims could be received. The urgency that had driven construction for 74 years began to dissipate. The choir of Cologne Cathedral represented both triumph and limitation. It showed what Gothic architecture could achieve when resources and skill combined in pursuit of a transcendent vision. But it also showed the limits of human ambition in the face of time and circumstance. The medieval builders had created something extraordinary. They had not been able to complete it. Today, visitors still enter through the western doors and walk the length of the nave toward the choir. They pass the temporary wall site, long since incorporated into the permanent structure. They emerge into the choir and look up at the vault that has floated overhead for 7 centuries. They see the windows that have filtered light since before the Black Death, before the printing press, before the discovery of the Americas. They stand where pilgrims have stood since 1322, adding their presence to the millions who came before. The choir of light remains what it was designed to be, a space that lifts the eye toward heaven, a demonstration of what faith and engineering can achieve, a home for relics that changed the history of a city, and a reminder that even the greatest achievements are rarely complete, that every cathedral is a fragment of a larger dream, that the space between ambition and accomplishment is where most of human history unfolds. The stained glass still glows. The shrine still rests behind the altar. The choir stalls still bear the marks of the craftsmen who carved them. 700 years have passed, and the choir of Cologne Cathedral still does what its builders intended. It still makes visitors feel small in the presence of something vast. It still transforms light into color, and color into wonder. It still reaches toward heaven. That is what Master Gerhardt envisioned when he drew his plans on parchment. That is what generations of workers achieved as they hauled stone and cut glass and raised walls course by course toward the sky. The choir of light was their gift to the future, a gift that survives wars and revolutions and the slow erosion of time, a gift that still inspires wonder in anyone who steps inside and looks up. Chapter 4. The crane that stood for centuries. For 400 years, the most distinctive feature of the Cologne skyline was not the cathedral itself. It was a crane. A massive wooden crane sitting atop the unfinished South Tower, visible from miles away, frozen in place like a monument to interrupted ambition. The crane had lifted the final stones into position sometime in the 1500s. It had never been removed, and for generation after generation it stood against the sky, reminding everyone who saw it that the greatest Gothic cathedral in Germany remained unfinished. The halt of construction was not sudden. It was gradual, a slow fade rather than a clean break. After the choir was consecrated in 1322, work continued on the western end of the building. The nave was begun. The foundations for the towers were laid. Under Master Michael and his successors, the South Tower rose course by course through the 14th century. The great bells, Pretiosa and Speciosa, were cast and installed in 1448 and 1449. The tower reached its belfry level, complete except for the spire that would crown it. And then the work slowed. The records become sparse. The last known cathedral architect, Johann Queny van Frankenberg, appears in documents from 1491 and is not mentioned again. Around 1500, the foundation stone for the North Tower was laid, but this seems to have been more symbolic than substantive. By 1530, construction had essentially ceased. The reasons were never officially explained. What remained was a strange hybrid of completion and incompleteness. The magnificent choir stood finished and functioning, sealed from the rest of the building by a wall that had been intended as temporary. Attached to it was a partial nave, roofed but not vaulted, its side aisles complete, but its central space covered with an improvised roof far below where the Gothic vault should soar. The South Tower rose impressively, but ended abruptly without its spire. The North Tower barely existed. The great western facade, designed to be one of the most elaborate in Christendom, remained a sketch on parchment. And atop the South Tower, the crane. It was a treadwheel crane, the standard lifting device of medieval construction. Workers would walk inside great wooden wheels, and their motion would translate through gears and ropes into lifting power. The crane at Cologne could raise stones weighing 2 tons to heights of 25 meters or more. It was a sophisticated piece of engineering, essential for any major construction project, and it had been left in place when work stopped. Why did they not remove it? Perhaps they expected to resume construction soon. Perhaps removal was expensive and difficult. Perhaps no one took responsibility for the decision. Whatever the reason, the crane remained. And as years became decades and decades became centuries, it transformed from equipment into symbol. Artists painted it. Arnold Mercator depicted it in 1570, showing the unfinished cathedral with the crane clearly visible against the sky. Engravers included it in views of the city. Travelers remarked on it in their journals. The crane became as much a part of Cologne's identity as the cathedral itself, though it represented failure where the choir represented triumph. The reasons for the construction halt were multiple and interlocking. Money was always the fundamental issue. Building a Gothic cathedral required vast resources. Stone had to be quarried, transported, cut, and lifted into place. Skilled workers had to be paid. Materials for windows, for metalwork, for woodwork, all had to be purchased. The project consumed wealth at a rate that few entities could sustain indefinitely. The cathedral's finances depended on multiple sources. Pilgrim donations provided significant revenue. The faithful who came to venerate the three kings left coins, some modest, some substantial. Local merchants and guilds contributed. The archbishop drew on church revenues. But pilgrimage traffic fluctuated with wars and plagues and economic conditions. Donations were unpredictable, and the costs never stopped. The Reformation dealt a severe blow. Martin Luther's challenge to Catholic authority beginning in 1517 split Germany along religious lines. Protestant territories rejected the veneration of relics as superstition. They condemned the spending of vast sums on churches while the poor went hungry. The flow of pilgrims to Catholic shrines diminished. The theological justification for such building projects came under sustained attack. Cologne remained Catholic, but the Reformation's effects rippled through even loyal territories. Resources that might once have gone to cathedral construction now went to defending the faith against Protestant advances. The intellectual climate changed. The medieval world that had conceived the cathedral was giving way to a modern world with different priorities and different values. The 30 Years' War, from 1618 to 1648, devastated Germany. Armies marched back and forth across the land. Cities were sacked. Populations were decimated by war and the plagues and famines that followed in its wake. Cologne escaped the worst of the destruction, but could not escape the general collapse of the German economy and social order. Cathedral construction during such times was unthinkable, and even after the wars ended, the old momentum never returned. The Baroque age had different aesthetic preferences. The soaring verticals of Gothic seemed primitive to eyes trained on classical proportions. The elaborate stonework seemed excessive. A new cathedral built in the 17th or 18th century would look entirely different. There was no enthusiasm for completing a medieval project in a medieval style. So the cathedral sat unfinished. Services continued in the choir. The bells rang from the south tower. Pilgrims still came, though in reduced numbers, to visit the shrine of the Three Kings. The building functioned as a church, even if it did not function as its architects had intended. The crane weathered every storm. Its wooden members darkened with age. Its ropes rotted and were replaced or simply fell away. It ceased to be operational centuries before it was finally removed. But it stood, a wooden skeleton against the sky, visible from the Rhine, visible from the surrounding countryside, impossible to ignore or forget. Visitors in the 17th and 18th centuries left vivid descriptions of what they found. The choir was magnificent, they agreed, one of the finest Gothic interiors anywhere. But the nave was a disappointment, covered with a low provisional roof that robbed it of all grandeur. The towers were an embarrassment, one half complete, and the other barely begun. The western facade was a jumble of medieval stonework and temporary additions, and everywhere there was decay. Neglected stonework crumbling under rain and frost, weeds growing in the joints, an air of abandonment hanging over what should have been a triumph. The French Revolution brought new dangers. When revolutionary armies conquered the Rhineland in the 1790s, they showed no respect for religious buildings. Churches were desecrated, their treasures seized, their stones sometimes quarried for other projects. The shrine of the Three Kings was hurriedly moved to safety at the Premonstratensian Abbey of Weddinghausen. It would not return to Cologne until 1808. The occupation was hard on the cathedral. French soldiers used it as a warehouse and stable. The interior suffered damage. The neglect that had characterized the previous centuries accelerated. By the early 19th century, serious voices were suggesting that the building be demolished entirely. It was too expensive to maintain, too massive to repair, too incomplete to justify preservation. Better to tear it down and use the stone for something useful. That the cathedral survived this period owed much to changing attitudes. The Romantic movement was rediscovering the Middle Ages. Writers and artists who had dismissed Gothic as barbaric began to see beauty in its pointed arches and soaring vaults. National sentiment was awakening in Germany, fragmented into hundreds of small states, but increasingly aware of a shared cultural heritage. The unfinished cathedral at Cologne began to look less like an embarrassing failure and more like a sacred trust, a project that the present generation had an obligation to complete. The turning point came with a remarkable discovery. In 1814, two scholars named Sulpice Boisseret and Georg Müller found half of the original medieval elevation drawings for the western facade in an attic in Darmstadt. The other half had been located years earlier in Paris, carried there during the French occupation. Together, these drawings revealed exactly what Master Gerhardt and his successors had envisioned. They showed the twin towers rising to their full height, crowned with delicate spires of open stonework. They showed the facade in all its elaborate detail. They showed what the cathedral should be. The discovery electrified German intellectuals. Here was proof that the medieval builders had known exactly what they wanted to create. Here was a blueprint for completion. The drawings were published, discussed, celebrated. The great German writer Johann Wolfgang von Goethe, who in his youth had dismissed Gothic architecture, now praised the Cologne design as a pinnacle of German achievement. A movement began to form. Voices called for the cathedral to be completed. not altered or modernized, but finished according to the original medieval plans. It would be an act of national pride, a symbol of German unity, a demonstration that the present generation could match the faith and skill of their ancestors. The crane that had stood for 400 years would finally be removed. The work would finally resume. The crane had waited long enough. For 4 centuries it had symbolized interruption, delay, defeat. Soon it would come down, and in its place would rise the spires that the medieval builders had always intended. The dream that had been deferred would finally be fulfilled. But that fulfillment required more than enthusiasm. It required money. It required political will. It required an entire nation to commit to a project that had defeated their ancestors. The crane stood against the sky as it had for generation after generation, waiting to see if this time would be different. This time would be different. Chapter 5. The Mai, Romantic Resurrection. In 1840, a new king took the Prussian throne. Friedrich Wilhelm IV was not like his predecessors. He was a dreamer, a romantic, a man who believed in the power of symbols and the importance of the past. His courtiers called him the romantic on the throne, and they meant it partly as a compliment and partly as a worry. Romantics were unpredictable. They followed their hearts rather than their ledgers. And Friedrich Wilhelm's heart was set on Cologne Cathedral. Prussia had acquired the Rhineland in 1815 after Napoleon's final defeat. This gave the Protestant kingdom control over heavily Catholic territories, including the city of Cologne with its unfinished cathedral and its treasured relics. The relationship was uneasy. Prussian authorities regarded Catholic institutions with suspicion. Catholic residents resented Protestant rule. The cathedral sat between them, a symbol that could unite or divide. Friedrich Wilhelm saw an opportunity. If Prussia completed the cathedral, it would demonstrate respect for Catholic traditions. It would bind the Rhineland more closely to the kingdom. It would channel German national sentiment toward a project that transcended religious divisions. And it would create a monument that would associate the Hohenzollern dynasty with one of the great achievements of European culture. The intellectual groundwork had already been laid. The rediscovery of the medieval drawings had sparked intense interest. Sulpice Boisseret, who had found half of the original facade plans, became an influential advocate for completion. He published detailed studies of the drawings. He lobbied officials and intellectuals. He built a coalition that included Catholics and Protestants, conservatives and liberals, united by a vision of the completed cathedral. The vision was not merely architectural, it was national. Germany in 1840 was not a unified country. It was a patchwork of kingdoms, duchies, and principalities, loosely bound in a Germanic confederation, but lacking any central government or common institutions. Yet a sense of German national identity was growing, fed by shared language, shared culture, shared history. The Cologne Cathedral could symbolize that identity. Its completion could be an act of national will, demonstrating what Germans could achieve when they worked together. Friedrich Wilhelm embraced this vision with enthusiasm. On September 4th, 1842, he traveled to Cologne for a ceremony that would restart construction after more than 3 centuries. It was a major state occasion. Flags flew from every building. Crowds lined the streets. Dignitaries gathered on the cathedral square. The king himself laid a symbolic stone, linking his reign to the medieval builders who had laid the first foundation in 1248. In his speech, Friedrich Wilhelm declared that the cathedral belonged to all of Germany. Its completion would honor the faith and skill of ancestors. It would demonstrate the unity of the German people. It would create a monument that would stand for centuries, a testament to what this generation could accomplish. The rhetoric was soaring, romantic, deliberately emotional. The king was selling a dream. But dreams require money, and the cathedral needed enormous sums. The Prussian state committed to providing 1/3 of the costs. The remaining two-thirds would come from private donations collected by the Central Cathedral Building Association, the Zentraldomverein, founded in 1842 specifically for this purpose. The association launched a fundraising campaign unprecedented in German history. They collected from wealthy merchants and from factory workers, contributing a few coins from their wages. They sold commemorative items, certificates, badges identifying donors as supporters of the great project. They organized concerts and festivals with proceeds going to the Cathedral Fund. They tapped into the rising tide of German national feeling, making contribution to the cathedral an act of patriotism as much as piety. The response was remarkable. Money flowed in from across the German states, from communities that had no direct connection to Cologne, from immigrants in America and elsewhere who wanted to participate in this national enterprise. Over the next 4 decades, the association would raise roughly 2/3 of the total cost, an amount equivalent to over $1 billion in today's purchasing power. The architect chosen to lead the completion was Ernst Friedrich Zwirner. He was a practical man with deep knowledge of Gothic architecture and respect for the medieval plans. His charge was not to redesign the cathedral, but to finish it according to the original intentions. The medieval drawings provided the template. Modern construction techniques would provide the means. Zwirner faced enormous challenges. The building had stood incomplete for 3 centuries. Weathering had damaged much of the existing stonework. Some medieval elements needed repair before new construction could proceed. The temporary roof over the nave had to be removed and replaced with proper Gothic vaulting. The towers had to be completed according to plans that had never been tested in reality, but Zwirner also had advantages his medieval predecessors lacked. Iron was now available in quantities and qualities unknown to earlier builders. He used iron roof girders to span distances that would have required heavy timber or stone vaulting. Iron tie rods reinforced the structure in ways impossible before the Industrial Revolution. The medieval exterior would be authentic. The modern interior structure would make it more practical and durable. Work began on multiple fronts. The South Tower, which had reached its belfry level in the 15th century, needed its spire completed. The North Tower, barely begun, required construction almost from the ground up. The nave needed its provisional roof removed and its Gothic vault finally installed. The western facade needed its elaborate portals carved and set in place. The scale of the operation was immense. At peak construction, hundreds of workers swarmed over the site. Stonemasons cut blocks to match the medieval stonework. Sculptors carved the hundreds of figures that would populate the portals and pinnacles. Carpenters built scaffolding that climbed higher than any in Germany. The construction site became a tourist attraction in its own right, drawing visitors eager to witness history in the making. The stone came from the same sources the medieval builders had used: limestone from the Drachenfels, trachyte, and sandstone from local quarries. Matching the original stone was essential for visual consistency. The new work had to look like a continuation of the old, not an addition or modification. Walking through the completed cathedral, it would be almost impossible to tell where medieval construction ended and 19th century work began. Almost impossible, but not quite. The medieval choir is more varied in its details, more organic in its execution. The 19th century work is more mechanical, more precise, more uniform. Experts can distinguish the phases, but to ordinary visitors, the cathedral appears unified, a single vision, executed across 6 centuries. Zwirner worked on the cathedral until his death in 1861. His successor, Richard Voigtel, continued the project, following the same principles of fidelity to the medieval design. Year by year, the towers climbed higher. The vault over the nave was completed. The facade began to take its final form. The political context shifted as the project progressed. Prussia united Germany through wars against Denmark, Austria, and France. In 1871, King Wilhelm I of Prussia became Kaiser Wilhelm I, emperor of a unified German nation. The Cologne Cathedral was no longer a symbol of hoped for unity. It was a symbol of achieved unity, a monument to the nation that had come into being during its construction. The Franco-Prussian War of 1870 to 1871 provided an unexpected contribution to the project. Kaiser Wilhelm I donated 22 French bronze cannons, captured during the war, to be melted down and cast into a great bell for the cathedral. The symbolism was heavy-handed but effective. German victory transformed into sacred purpose, enemy weapons becoming instruments of worship. The bell casting was troubled. The first attempt in 1873 produced a bell with unsatisfactory tone. A second attempt also failed. A third attempt in 1874 finally produced an acceptable result. The Kaiserglocke, weighing over 27,000 kilograms, was installed in the South Tower in 1875. It rang for the first time on Pentecost. The sound could be heard for miles. The Kaiserglocke would be melted down for the German war effort in 1918. But in the 1870s, it represented triumph, the marriage of military victory and spiritual purpose that characterized the new German Empire. By 1880, after 38 years of construction, the cathedral was essentially complete. The towers rose to their full height of 157 meters. The spires of open stonework crowned them exactly as the medieval drawings had specified. The facade displayed its elaborate portals with hundreds of sculpted figures. The interior stretched unbroken from western entrance to eastern choir. A ceremony was planned for October 15th, 1880. Kaiser Wilhelm I would preside, just as his predecessor Friedrich Wilhelm IV had presided at the restart of construction 38 years earlier. Dignitaries would gather from across Germany and beyond. The completion of the cathedral would be celebrated as a national achievement, the fulfillment of a 632-year-old dream. The dream born of bones in 1164, the foundation stone laid in 1248, the choir consecrated in 1322, the crane that had stood for 400 years, all of it would culminate in this moment. The Romantic resurrection was complete. The Gothic dream was finally real. For a brief moment, Cologne Cathedral was the tallest structure in the world, 157 meters, higher than any building humanity had ever constructed. The twin spires that Master Gerhard had sketched on parchment in the 13th century now dominated the skyline of one of Europe's greatest cities. The vision had survived wars and reformations and revolutions. It had outlasted empires. And now, at last, it stood complete. But complete is a relative term for a building made of stone. The maintenance would never stop. The weathering would never cease. Even as the ceremonies celebrated completion, workers were already planning the next round of repairs. The cathedral that had taken 6 centuries to build would require eternal vigilance to maintain. The Romantic resurrection had achieved something remarkable. It had united a nation around a shared cultural project. It had demonstrated that industrial age resources could serve medieval ideals. It had created a monument that would define Cologne and inspire visitors for generations to come. What the Romantics could not foresee was what the next century would bring. Wars more terrible than any in history, bombs falling from the sky, a city reduced to rubble while the cathedral somehow survived. The Romantic dream would face tests that Friedrich Wilhelm IV could never have imagined. But on that October day in 1880, none of that mattered. The crane was gone. The towers were complete. The cathedral stood finished at last. And the people of Cologne could finally see what their ancestors had always imagined, twin spires reaching toward heaven, exactly as the medieval builders had intended. Chapter 6. The Completion of a Dream. October 15th, 1880. The streets of Cologne overflow with people. Flags hang from every window. Bands play patriotic music on the squares. From miles away, pilgrims and dignitaries approach the city, drawn by the promise of witnessing something that no living person has ever seen. Today, after 632 years, the cathedral will be declared complete. Kaiser Wilhelm I arrives in state. He is 83 years old, the first emperor of a unified Germany, the man whose wars of conquest created the nation that now celebrates. He has seen the cathedral project through, from symbolic restart to final completion. His predecessor, Friedrich Wilhelm IV, laid the stone that recommenced construction in 1842. Wilhelm I will set the final stone that marks its end. The ceremony is carefully staged. Religious leaders and political officials fill the interior. Choirs sing hymns composed for the occasion. Prayers are offered in Latin and German. The Kaiser speaks of faith, of unity, of the achievement that binds past to present. Outside, cannon fire marks the moment. Church bells ring across the city. The completion of Cologne Cathedral is not merely a local celebration. It is a national event, broadcast through newspapers and telegraphed to every corner of the German Empire. At 157 meters, the Twin Towers make Cologne Cathedral the tallest structure in the world. The Washington Monument, still under construction, will surpass it in 1884. The Eiffel Tower will dwarf it in 1889. But for this moment, for these few years, the Gothic spires that Master Gerhard imagined in the 13th century represent the highest point humanity has ever built. The statistics are staggering. The cathedral stretches 144 meters in length and 86 meters in width. The nave rises nearly 44 meters from floor to vault. The towers contain 533 stone steps leading to viewing platforms that offer panoramic views of the Rhine Valley. The surface area of the windows exceeds 10,000 square meters, the largest of any church in the world. 300,000 tons of stone went into the construction. The cost, adjusted for modern currency, exceeded $1 billion. The workforce that completed the project numbered in the hundreds at peak construction. Stonemasons, sculptors, carpenters, metalworkers, glaziers, laborers of every kind contributed their skills. Many came from families that had worked on the cathedral for generations, their ancestors having been employed on the medieval construction. Others brought new techniques learned in the industrial age. Together, they achieved what their predecessors could only imagine. The fidelity to the original design was remarkable. Ernst Friedrich Zwirner and his successor, Richard Voigtel, followed the medieval drawings with meticulous care. They matched stone types to the original materials. They reproduced decorative details according to 13th century patterns. They ensured that the completed cathedral would look like a unified whole rather than a patchwork of different eras. Only experts can distinguish the medieval work from the 19th century additions. The choir retains its original character, more varied and organic in its details. The nave and towers show the precision of industrial age craftsmanship, more uniform and mechanical. But to ordinary visitors, the cathedral appears seamless. The dream that Master Gerhard sketched on parchment has become reality, and it looks exactly as he intended. The western facade dominates the view from the cathedral square. Twin towers frame an elaborate central portal with 3 doorways beneath carved tympanums, depicting scenes from Scripture. Hundreds of sculptures populate the niches and pinnacles, saints and prophets, and biblical figures frozen in stone. The detail work is overwhelming. A visitor could spend hours examining the facade and still miss significant elements. Inside, the experience shifts from complexity to simplicity. The Gothic vocabulary of pointed arches and ribbed vaults creates a rhythm that carries the eye upward. The immense height of the nave makes visitors feel small, which is precisely the intention. Medieval builders designed these spaces to inspire humility before God. The vastness of the interior reminds worshippers of their insignificance in the cosmic order. The light changes everything. On sunny days, colored beams stream through the stained glass windows, painting shifting patterns on the stone floors. On cloudy days, the interior takes on a somber gray quality, the stone absorbing rather than reflecting what little light enters. The medieval windows in the choir glow with deep blues and reds. The 19th century windows in the nave are brighter, more varied in palette. Together, they create an ever-changing play of illumination that no photograph can capture. The shrine of the Three Kings rests behind the high altar, exactly where it has rested since the choir was consecrated in 1322. The golden surface catches candlelight and electric light alike, glowing amid the surrounding stone. Pilgrims still approach it through the ambulatory, walking the same circuit that medieval visitors walked. They still pray before the relics, still touch the ironwork, still seek whatever blessing or healing or forgiveness brought them to Cologne. The completion of the cathedral came at a particular moment in German history. The empire was new, unified only 9 years earlier through Prussian military victories. National identity was still being constructed, still being defined against regional and religious divisions. The cathedral served as a symbol of that identity, a project that transcended Catholic and Protestant, Prussian and Bavarian, conservative and liberal. The symbolism was deliberately cultivated. The Kaiserglocke, cast from captured French cannons, rang out Prussian military triumph. The presence of the Protestant Kaiser at a Catholic ceremony demonstrated religious tolerance under national unity. The funds raised from across Germany showed what the nation could accomplish when it worked together. The cathedral became a monument not just to faith, but to nation. But even as the ceremonies celebrated completion, the work was already beginning again. Stone weathers, rain erodes carved surfaces. Frost opens cracks that spread year by year. A building of this scale requires constant attention. The Dombauhütte, the cathedral workshop established in medieval times, never closed. It transitioned seamlessly from construction to preservation, its stonemasons now repairing rather than installing, but their skills unchanged. Within months of the completion ceremony, scaffolding began appearing on the towers. A figure that had fallen from the facade needed repair. Water damage in the roof required attention. The endless cycle of maintenance that would characterize the next century and a half had already begun. Richard Voigtel, who had overseen the final phase of construction, remained as master builder until his death in 1902. Shortly before dying, he publicly declared the cathedral finished. But he knew better than anyone that finished was a relative term. Gothic cathedrals are never truly complete. They exist in a perpetual state of becoming, their stone surfaces slowly dissolving under the assault of weather and time, requiring constant intervention to maintain their form. The people of Cologne developed a saying that captured this truth. When the cathedral is finished, the world will end. It was a joke, an acknowledgement that the scaffolding would never fully come down, that workers would always be climbing the towers and repairing the portals. But it was also a statement of faith, a declaration that as long as the cathedral stood, as long as its maintenance continued, Cologne would endure. The completion of 1880 marked a transition, not an ending. The medieval dream had been realized. The romantic vision had been fulfilled. The national symbol had been established. But the building itself continued to demand attention, to consume resources, to require the same patience and skill that had characterized its construction across 6 centuries. Visitors came in increasing numbers. The cathedral became one of the most visited landmarks in Europe, drawing travelers from across the continent and beyond. Guidebooks praised its architecture. Artists sketched and painted its towers. Photographers captured images that circulated around the world. Cologne Cathedral entered the global imagination as a symbol of Gothic achievement, of German culture, of faith expressed in stone. For 60 years after its completion, the cathedral stood in peace. It survived the First World War, though the Kaiserglocke was melted down for the war effort in 1918, It survived the turmoil of the Weimar Republic. It survived the rise of the Nazis, who attempted to appropriate its symbolism for their own purposes. The cathedral remained what it had always been, a place of worship, a destination for pilgrims, a monument to something larger than any political regime. And then came 1942. The first bombs fell on Cologne. The greatest test of the cathedral's 600-year existence was about to begin. The dream that had survived construction halts and religious reformations and political revolutions would now face industrial warfare. The building that had taken 6 centuries to complete would have to survive destruction that took only minutes to accomplish. The completion of 1880 had seemed like an ending. It was actually preparation for an ordeal that no one in that celebration could have imagined. The cathedral stood complete. The question now was whether it would stand at all. Chapter 7. Baptism by Fire. The night of May 30th, 1942, more than 1,000 British bombers crossed the English Channel heading for Germany. Their target is Cologne. This is Operation Millennium, the first 1,000-bomber raid in history, designed to demonstrate that aerial bombardment can break German morale and hasten the end of the war. The people of Cologne are about to experience destruction on a scale that no city has ever witnessed. The bombers arrive in waves. High explosive bombs blast buildings apart. Incendiary bombs start fires that merge into firestorms. Anti-aircraft guns fill the sky with flak. Searchlights sweep the darkness. But the bombers are too many, too fast, too high. They drop their loads and turn for home, leaving behind a city in flames. When dawn breaks, a third of Cologne lies in ruins. Entire neighborhoods have been flattened. Fires still burn in the wreckage. The dead number in the hundreds, the homeless number in the thousands. And rising above the destruction, damaged but standing, is the cathedral. The twin spires have served as a navigational landmark for the bombers. The pilots used them to orient themselves, to confirm their position before releasing their payloads. Some historians suggest this is why the cathedral was not specifically targeted, that destroying such a useful reference point would have been counterproductive. Others argue that the sheer difficulty of hitting a single building, even one this large, from high altitude at night, explains its survival. Still others invoke divine providence, faith that God protected his house. Whatever the reason, the cathedral survived. It would survive much more in the years to come. Cologne was bombed 262 times during the Second World War. The Royal Air Force returned again and again, each raid adding to the destruction. By the war's end, 95% of the city's buildings had been damaged or destroyed. The population that had numbered 770,000 before the war dwindled to barely 20,000. Survivors huddled in basements and ruins while bombs continued to fall. The cathedral took 14 direct hits from explosive bombs and approximately 70 incendiary bombs. Each impact caused damage. Holes opened in the roof, windows shattered, stonework crumbled. The base of the northwest tower suffered a hit in November 1943 that threatened the structural integrity of the entire tower. Emergency repairs using poor quality brick taken from nearby ruins stabilized the damage. But the scar remained visible for over 60 years. The medieval stained glass windows, irreplaceable treasures representing centuries of craftsmanship, had been removed before the bombing began. Workers carefully took apart the lead cames, cataloged each piece of glass, packed them in protective containers, and transported them to safe storage outside the city. This foresight saved one of the greatest collections of medieval glass in Europe. When the bombs fell, they shattered only the replacement glass that had been installed in the window's absence. As the war progressed and the bombing intensified, the cathedral became a symbol of something larger than itself. It stood amid the ruins like a skeletal survivor, its towers visible from miles away, rising above a landscape of rubble. For the people of Cologne, it represented hope, proof that not everything could be destroyed, that some things endured, no matter what humanity inflicted upon itself. The Germans were not the only ones who saw symbolic value in the cathedral's survival. Allied soldiers advancing toward the Rhine in early 1945 saw it too. The twin spires appeared on the horizon long before the city itself came into view. They guided the troops forward, landmarks in a shattered landscape, evidence that their bombs had not destroyed everything. On March 6, 1945, American tanks rolled into Cologne from the west. The city fell quickly. Most German defenders had already retreated across the Rhine to establish defensive positions on the eastern bank. What remained was a ghost city, rubble and ruins and a handful of survivors emerging from hiding. The cathedral stood in the middle of the battlefield. Just days earlier, on March 2nd, the final bombing raid had struck the city. Now, American tanks rumbled through streets choked with debris, their commanders using the cathedral towers as reference points. One of the most famous tank battles of the war erupted in the cathedral's shadow. A German Panther tank from Panzer, Brigade 106 Feldherrnhalle, waited in ambush near the Marzellenstrasse. American Sherman tanks of the 3rd Armored Division approached along the main road toward the cathedral. The Panther opened fire, destroying a Sherman and killing 3 of its crew. For hours, the duel continued, German and American tanks exchanging shots amid the rubble. The battle ended when an American Pershing tank, heavier and more powerful than the Shermans, found a firing position and knocked out the Panther. Combat cameramen from the 165th Photo Signal Company filmed the engagement, creating footage that remains one of the most dramatic records of armored warfare from the Second World War. The destroyed Panther was dragged to the base of the cathedral and left there as a trophy. Photographs show the burned-out hulk resting before the Gothic portals, a symbol of German defeat placed deliberately at the foot of Germany's greatest religious monument. The message was clear. The war was over. Germany had lost. But the cathedral still stood. An American military chaplain named Philip Hannon entered the cathedral shortly after the city fell. He was deeply moved by what he found. The building was damaged, holes in the roof and debris on the floor, but it was intact. The structure had survived. The faith that built it had outlasted the war that tried to destroy it. Hannon sought out the Archbishop of Cologne, Joseph Frings, who was sheltering nearby. On April 16, 1945, Frings signed a document authorizing Chaplain Hannon to protect the cathedral and all its contents. American guards were posted at the entrances. Looting was prevented. The treasures that had survived the bombs would survive the occupation. The war in Europe ended on May 8, 1945. Germany lay in ruins. Cologne was virtually destroyed. But the cathedral still stood. Its survival seemed miraculous to those who had witnessed the destruction. 95% of the city flattened, and yet this medieval structure, this 600-year-old monument, remained. The explanations varied. The cathedral's location next to the main train station made it a target that bombers would want to avoid for fear of damaging railway infrastructure. The twin spires served as navigation aids that pilots wanted to preserve. The stone construction resisted fire better than the wooden and brick buildings surrounding it. Divine intervention protected God's house. All of these factors probably contributed. None fully explained why the bombs that destroyed everything else spared this one building. Photographs from 1945 show the cathedral rising above a wasteland. Every building around it has been reduced to rubble. Streets are impassable, choked with debris. No trees remain, no vegetation, nothing but broken stone and twisted metal. And in the middle of this apocalyptic landscape, the cathedral stands like a monument to something indestructible. The damage was real and significant. The roof had multiple holes requiring emergency patching. Stone carvings had been shattered by blast impacts. The brick repair on the northwest tower was an ugly scar visible from across the city. The interior was littered with debris and dust. But the fundamental structure remained sound. The walls stood. The vaults held. The towers still reached toward heaven. Archbishop Frings made repairing the cathedral a priority. Even as his congregation struggled to find food and shelter in a destroyed city, even as Germany faced occupation and partition and the long process of rebuilding, the work began. The Dombauhütte, the cathedral workshop that had been maintaining the building since medieval times, turned its attention to repair. By 1948, the 700th anniversary of the foundation stone laying, the choir was again in regular use. The medieval stained glass windows returned from their wartime storage, carefully reinstalled in their original positions. Services resumed. The cathedral began to function again as a place of worship, a symbol of continuity in a world that had been utterly transformed. The full restoration would take decades. The war damage was not fully repaired until 1956. The brick scar on the northwest tower remained visible until 2005, when the cathedral authorities decided to restore it to its original appearance. For 60 years, that patch of mismatched brick served as a reminder of what the cathedral had survived, a memorial to the war built into the fabric of the building itself. The baptism by fire was over. The cathedral had been tested as never before and had endured. The dream born of bones, the vision of Master Gerhard, the romantic resurrection of the 19th century had all faced industrial warfare and survived. The people of Cologne could rebuild their city knowing that its heart still beat, that the twin spires still marked the skyline, that some things truly were indestructible. But the survival brought obligations. A building that had endured such ordeal deserved preservation. The constant maintenance that had characterized the cathedral's existence would continue, intensified now by the need to repair bomb damage on top of the endless battle against weather and time. The cathedral had survived the war. Now it needed to survive the peace. Chapter 8. A permanent construction site. There is a saying in Cologne that captures something essential about the cathedral. When the dome is finished, the world will end. It is spoken with a smile, an acknowledgement that the scaffolding never fully comes down, that workers are always climbing somewhere on the facade, that the building exists in a perpetual state of repair. The saying is a joke. It is also the truth. The people of Cologne have grown accustomed to seeing their cathedral wrapped in scaffolding. It is part of the view, as permanent as the spires themselves. Tourists photograph the towers and include the scaffolding without comment. Postcards and souvenirs show the cathedral as it might appear in an idealized moment, scaffold-free, but the actual building has not been without scaffolding for any significant period since construction resumed in 1842. Barbara Schock-Werner, who served as master, builder of the cathedral from 1999 to 2012, said it plainly. Cologne Cathedral without scaffolding is not a pipe dream, but a nightmare. It would mean that we could no longer afford the cathedral. The scaffolding is not a sign of problems. It is a sign of solutions being implemented. Remove the scaffolding, and the building begins to die. The challenge is fundamental to the nature of Gothic architecture. These buildings were designed to dissolve walls and fill interiors with light. To achieve this, they pushed stone to its structural limits. Flying buttresses and pointed arches and ribbed vaults distributed weight efficiently, but they also created complex systems with countless points of potential failure. Every joint, every carved surface, every piece of tracery is a place where water can enter, where frost can expand, where dissolution can begin. The stone itself compounds the problem. Cologne Cathedral is built from multiple types of rock, trachyte from local quarries, sandstone from various sources, limestone from the Drachenfels along the Rhine. Each type weathers differently. Some are more resistant to acid rain. Some fracture more readily under thermal stress. The original medieval builders chose materials that were available and workable. They could not anticipate industrial pollution, automobile exhaust, or the particular challenges of the modern environment. By the mid-20th century, acid rain had become a serious threat. Industrial emissions from factories and power plants combined with moisture in the atmosphere to create precipitation that was mildly corrosive. This fell on the cathedral year after year, decade after decade. The acid attacked calcium carbonate, the primary constituent of limestone and marble. Carved surfaces that had survived centuries of ordinary weather began to dissolve under chemical assault. The cathedral turned black. The pale stone that had characterized the building in medieval and early modern times became coated with soot and grime. Photographs from the 19th and early 20th centuries show a building that looks completely different from the structure we see today. The darkness was not merely aesthetic. It indicated chemical changes happening within the stone, processes that could eventually compromise structural integrity. The response required industrial-scale organization. The Dombauhütte, the cathedral workshop, employs approximately 100 people today. 80 of them are craftsmen, stonemasons and sculptors, carpenters and metalworkers, glaziers and glass restorers, painters and goldsmiths, roofers and electricians. 20 more work in science and administration, archaeologists and art historians and managers coordinating the endless work. The annual budget for maintenance runs between 6 and 10 million euros. Roughly 60% comes from the Zentraldombauverein, the Central Cathedral Building Association founded in 1842 to fund the completion of the cathedral. The association has existed for over 180 years, continuously raising money, continuously supporting the work. Without its efforts, the cathedral could not be maintained. The remaining funds come from various sources. The Archdiocese of Cologne contributes. The state of North Rhine-Westphalia provides support. The federal government of Germany offers grants for heritage preservation. Admission fees for the tower climb, and the treasury add to the income. Donations from visitors, some modest and some substantial, help close the gap. The economics of maintaining a Gothic cathedral require constant attention. A fundraising effort as perpetual as the repairs it funds. The stonemasons who work on the cathedral today use tools and techniques that would be recognizable to their medieval predecessors. They cut stone by hand, shaping blocks to match eroded originals. They carve replacement sculptures using chisels and hammers, reproducing details that have been worn away by centuries of weather. They set new stones using the same methods employed in the 13th century, sealing joints with lead poured molten into the gaps. But they also use modern technology. 3-dimensional scanning captures the exact geometry of damaged elements, creating digital records and templates for reproduction. Laser cleaning removes accumulated grime without damaging underlying stone. New materials that resist acid rain better than traditional limestone are used for replacements in heavily exposed positions. The craft remains traditional, but it is informed by science that Master Gerhard could never have imagined. The work follows a rotating schedule that covers the entire building over time. Sections are assessed for damage. Priorities are established based on structural urgency and available resources. Scaffolding goes up. Workers spend months or years on a particular area. Scaffolding comes down. The process moves to the next section. By the time the entire building has been covered, the first sections need attention again. Some repairs take decades to complete. The Michael portal on the north side of the cathedral suffered severe damage during the Second World War. Bullet holes and crater-shaped blowouts scarred the relief sculptures depicting scenes from Christ's life. Restoration work on this single portal took 10 years, finishing in 2023. Workers used lasers to clean surfaces, stone and mortar to rebuild damaged areas, and painstaking handwork to restore the recognizability of the original carvings. The cost of that single restoration ran to 750,000 euros, funded largely by private sponsors through the Dombauverein. Each sponsor received recognition, their names associated with specific figures or sections of the portal. The British woman Bertha Woodward bequeathed her entire fortune to the cathedral workshop to repair war damage. Her generosity funded part of the Michaels, portal restoration, decades after her death. The greatest threat today is no longer acid rain. Environmental regulations have reduced industrial emissions significantly since the 1970s. The stone still weathers, but more slowly than during the peak pollution years. The current challenges include climate change, which brings more frequent extreme weather events, and the simple passage of time, which affects even the most carefully maintained structure. 20,000 visitors enter the cathedral every day, 6 million per year. Each visitor brings moisture from their breath, grit from their shoes, oils from their hands, if they touch surfaces they should not touch. The cumulative effect of all those bodies adds to the environmental load that the building must withstand. Managing visitor flow, protecting vulnerable elements, educating tourists about proper behavior, all of this falls to the cathedral staff. The value of what they protect is incalculable. The cathedral is officially carried on the books at €27, a nominal figure reflecting the fact that it cannot be sold and therefore has no market price. Insurance valuations would run into billions if anyone tried to calculate replacement cost. But the truth is that Cologne Cathedral cannot be replaced. The medieval glass, the carved choir stalls, the shrine of the three kings, the accumulation of 7 centuries of devotion and craft, these things cannot be recreated at any price. The work continues day after day, year after year, generation after generation. The stonemasons of today train apprentices who will become the stonemasons of tomorrow. The techniques are passed down. The knowledge is preserved. The institutional memory of the Dombauhütte stretches back to the 13th century, an unbroken chain of expertise devoted to a single building. Critics sometimes question the expense. Why spend millions of euros on an old building when there are hospitals to fund, schools to build, social problems to address? The answers are multiple. The cathedral is a cultural treasure belonging to humanity, not just to Cologne or Germany. It attracts tourists who spend money throughout the regional economy. It provides skilled employment for craftspeople who might otherwise find no market for their abilities. It connects the present to the past in ways that purely functional buildings cannot. But ultimately, the answer is simpler. The cathedral matters. It has mattered for 7 centuries. It will matter for centuries to come if it is properly maintained. The people of Cologne understand this. They have watched their cathedral survive war and neglect and pollution and time. They are not willing to let it fall now. The scaffolding will remain. The stonemasons will continue their work. The donations will keep flowing. The cathedral will stand. That is the commitment, the promise, the faith that sustains the permanent construction site. When the dome is finished, the world will end. But the dome will never be finished. And so the world continues, and the work goes on. Chapter 9. Between Medieval and Modern, August 25th, 2007. A new stained glass window is unveiled in the south transept of Cologne Cathedral. It is not medieval. It is not Gothic. It does not depict saints or biblical scenes or any recognizable imagery at all. Instead, it is a grid of colored squares. 11,263 pieces of glass in 72 different colors, arranged in a pattern that looks like nothing so much as a pixelated computer screen. The window is the work of Gerhard Richter, one of the most celebrated artists of the 20th and 21st centuries. He is a native of Dresden who has lived in Cologne since 1983. When the cathedral chapter asked him to design a replacement for a window destroyed in the Second World War, he created something that would become one of the most controversial and ultimately beloved additions to the building in its 700-year history. The original window in the south transept dated from 1863, a gift from the Kingdom of Prussia depicting secular and Christian rulers. Allied bombs destroyed it, along with so much else during the war. For nearly 60 years, the space was filled with plain, clear glass, a temporary solution that let in light but created harsh glare that disturbed the carefully balanced illumination of the interior. In 2003, the cathedral chapter decided to commission a proper replacement, The original designs were lost, destroyed along with the windows themselves. There was no historical template to follow. The chapter considered several options, including a window depicting 20th century Catholic martyrs, like Edith Stein and Maximilian Kolbe, a memorial to the Holocaust. Richter proposed something entirely different. He cut apart a photograph of one of his own paintings, a work called 4096 Colors from 1974, and pasted the fragments behind a model of the window's tracery. The effect was immediate and striking. Color without form, light without image, beauty without narrative. The cathedral chapter was intrigued but uncertain. They asked Richter to develop the design further. He agreed. Working with computer programmers and glass specialists, he refined his vision. The final window would use 72 colors, chosen to harmonize with the medieval glass already in the cathedral. The arrangement would be generated by a random number generator, with Richter making occasional adjustments to prevent accidental patterns that might suggest unintended meanings. The manufacturing cost ran to 370,000 euros, funded by roughly 1,200 donors. Richter himself worked without a fee. The glass was blown by hand at the Glashütte Lamberts, one of the few remaining makers of mouth-blown sheet glass. Each piece was cut to precise dimensions, 9.6 centimeters square. They were fixed not with traditional lead cames, but with silicone gel on a support disc, allowing the colors to interact without the dark lines that characterize conventional stained glass. The unveiling sparked immediate controversy. Cardinal Joachim Meissner, the Archbishop of Cologne, refused to attend. He declared that the window would be better suited to a mosque or another house of prayer. "If we are going to have a new window," he said, "it should be one that reflects our faith. Not just any." The criticism stung, but did not stick. As visitors encountered the window over the following months and years, opinion shifted. The abstract design proved surprisingly compatible with the Gothic interior. The colors, drawn from the same palette as the medieval windows, created resonances rather than conflicts. The light filtering through the thousands of tiny squares produced an effect that was at once contemporary and timeless. Critics came to see that Richter had done something profound. He had refused to compete with the medieval windows on their own terms. He had not tried to imitate Gothic imagery with modern means. Instead, he had created a work that was purely about light and color, the essential elements that medieval builders had always prized. The window was not religious in any conventional sense, but it was deeply spiritual, an invitation to contemplation that required no narrative, no doctrine, no predetermined meaning. The Richter window became one of the most visited features of the cathedral. Tourists seek it out, photographing the colored grid, watching how the light changes with the weather and the time of day. Art pilgrims come specifically to see it, traveling from around the world to experience Richter's vision in situ. It has become as emblematic of Cologne Cathedral as the medieval treasures that surround it. The success of the Richter window opened conversations about how Gothic buildings can incorporate contemporary art without betraying their essential character. In 2020, Richter completed 3 more stained glass windows for the Benedictine Tholi Abbey, adapting his pixelated approach to a different architectural context. The Cologne Commission had proved that medieval and modern could coexist, that respecting the past did not mean rejecting the present. The cathedral has always been a living institution, adapting to changing circumstances while maintaining its fundamental purpose. The Romantics of the 19th century completed a medieval design using industrial techniques. The restorers of the 20th century used laser cleaning and 3-dimensional scanning to preserve ancient stone. The commissioning of contemporary art in the 21st century continues this tradition of thoughtful adaptation. Other modern additions have found their place in the building. In 1998, a new organ was installed in the gallery, nicknamed the Swallow's Nest for its position high on the wall. Its modern pipes and contemporary housing sit amid Gothic stonework without apparent conflict. The The instrument serves the liturgical needs of a living church, while respecting the aesthetic achievement of its medieval builders. The question of how to balance preservation and adaptation runs through every decision about the cathedral. When stones erode beyond repair, should they be replaced with exact replicas or with modern alternatives that resist weathering better? When technology offers new possibilities for lighting or climate control or visitor management, how aggressively should they be implemented? When contemporary artists propose works for installation, what criteria should guide acceptance or rejection? There are no universal answers. Each case requires judgment, balancing respect for the past against the needs of the present and the possibilities of the future. The Dombauhütte approaches these questions with accumulated wisdom from centuries of experience, but also with openness to new ideas and methods. The goal is not to freeze the cathedral in a particular historical moment, but to keep it alive, functioning, relevant. The Richter window exemplifies this balance. It is unmistakably contemporary. No one could mistake it for medieval work. Yet it fits, it belongs. It enhances rather than diminishes the Gothic interior that surrounds it. This is the achievement, finding ways to add to a building without subtracting from what already exists. The cathedral today is a palimpsest, layer upon layer of history, visible to those who know how to read it. Medieval stone stands beside 19th century additions. War damage, repaired in the 1950s, shows different techniques than restoration work from the 2010s. Contemporary art hangs in spaces designed 700 years ago. Each layer tells part of the story, and together they tell a story richer than any single era could provide. The challenge for the future is to continue this layering without losing coherence. Each generation must add its contribution while respecting what came before. The Richter window proves this is possible. Abstract art and Gothic architecture, computer-generated patterns and hand-blown glass, the 21st century and the 13th, all can coexist in a single space that remains somehow unified, somehow whole. This is the miracle of Cologne Cathedral. Not that it has survived, though that is miracle enough, but that it has continued to grow, to change, to incorporate the new while preserving the old. It is not a museum. It is not a relic. It is a living building, as vital today as it was when the first pilgrims came to venerate the bones of the three kings. Between medieval and modern, between past and future, the cathedral stands. It bridges the gap, not by choosing one side or the other, but by embracing both. It proves that continuity and change are not opposites, but partners, that respecting tradition and welcoming innovation can happen simultaneously. This is its lesson for the ages, a lesson written in stone and light and colored glass. Chapter 10, The Eternal Builders, stand in the cathedral square at dawn. Watch the light touch the towers as the sun rises over the Rhine. The stone catches the first rays and begins to glow, that particular shade of pale gray that 7 centuries of weathering have produced. The city stirs around you, buses and trams and early commuters, but the cathedral remains still, ancient, impossibly enduring. This is the moment to ask the essential question: who built this? The obvious answer is that Master Gerhard built it, along with the generations of workers who followed his plans. But that answer is too simple. Master Gerhard died around 1260, when the cathedral was barely begun. He never saw the choir completed, never mind the towers and nave that would not be finished for 6 more centuries. The workers who laid the foundation stones in 1248 were dust long before the spires rose in 1880. The cathedral was built by people who knew they would not see it finished. Every stonemason who cut blocks for the choir, every carpenter who built scaffolding for the towers, every glazier who assembled the stained glass windows, understood that they were contributing to something larger than their own lifetimes. They worked not for themselves, but for generations unborn, trusting that others would continue what they started. This is extraordinary. Human beings are not naturally inclined to such patience. We want results. We want to see our efforts bear fruit. We struggle to maintain interest in projects that extend beyond our immediate horizons. Yet for 632 years, people kept building Cologne Cathedral. Through plagues and wars and reformations and revolutions, the work continued, not continuously, not steadily, but persistently. The vision survived even when the construction paused. Archbishop Reinhold von Dassel started it in 1164, when he brought the bones of the three kings from Milan. He wanted a pilgrimage destination that would enhance the prestige of his diocese. He could not have imagined what his ambition would ultimately create. The cathedral that would house those bones exceeded anything his era could conceive. Archbishop Conrad von Hochstaden laid the foundation stone in 1248. He intended a building that would rival the great French cathedrals, a structure worthy of the relics it would contain. He died in 1261, having seen only the earliest stages of construction. The choir that he commissioned was not consecrated until 1322, 61 years after his death. The workers who built the medieval portions knew they were part of something extraordinary. Their labor was an act of devotion as much as employment. They believed that contributing to God's house earned merit in heaven. The cathedral was a community project in the deepest sense, funded by donations from every level of society, built by craftsmen who passed their skills from father to son. When construction halted in the 1500s, the workers who laid down their tools expected someone to pick them up again. They left the crane atop the south tower, ready for the next phase. They preserved the drawings that showed what the completed building should look like. They trusted that the future would finish what they had started. 3 centuries passed. The crane weathered on the tower. The drawings yellowed in their archives. Germany changed utterly, fractured by religious conflict, devastated by war, transformed by Enlightenment and industrialization. Still, the unfinished cathedral stood, waiting. The Romantics, who resumed construction in 1842, felt a duty to their ancestors. They believed they were completing a sacred trust, honoring the intentions of builders who had been dead for centuries. Friedrich Wilhelm IV and the civic donors who funded the work understood themselves as links in a chain stretching back to Master Gerhard and forward to generations yet unborn. Ernst Friedrich Zwirner and Richard Feuchtel, the architects who oversaw the completion, approached the medieval drawings with reverence. They did not seek to improve upon the original design. They sought to realize it as faithfully as possible, using modern techniques only where necessary to achieve medieval intentions. The completed cathedral of 1880 would have been recognizable to the workers of 1248. That was the goal and the achievement. The 20th century brought tests that no previous generation could have imagined. 262 bombing raids, 14 direct hits, a city reduced to rubble while the cathedral somehow survived. The workers who repaired the war damage understood themselves as inheritors of the same tradition, stone cutters and glaziers and restorers adding their efforts to the accumulated work of 7 centuries. Today, approximately 100 workers at the Dombauhütte continue the labor. They are the latest in an unbroken line stretching back to the original construction crew. The stonemasons who repair eroded carvings use the same fundamental techniques as their medieval predecessors. The glaziers who maintain the stained glass windows work with materials and methods little changed since the 14th century. They are part of something larger than themselves, something that began before they were born and will continue after they die. This is what the cathedral teaches. Individual lives are short. Collective endeavors can be eternal. One person cannot build a Gothic cathedral. Thousands of people working across centuries can. The vision must be shared. The commitment must be renewed with each generation. The work must never stop, even when progress is invisible. 6 million visitors enter Cologne Cathedral each year. Some come as pilgrims, seeking the blessing of the three kings. Some come as tourists, cameras in hand, ticking off a destination on their European itinerary. Some come as art lovers, drawn by the medieval glass or the Richter window or the Gero crucifix. Some come for Mass, participating in the liturgy that has sounded in this space for 700 years. All of them encounter the same essential truth. They are standing in a space created by faith that spans centuries. The arches above their heads were raised by workers whose names are lost to history. The windows were glazed by craftsmen who saw this light fall on these same floors. The stones underfoot have been worn smooth by millions of predecessors, pilgrims and worshippers and tourists stretching back to the Middle Ages. The cathedral is not finished. The scaffolding proves it. The stonemasons working on the facade prove it. The eternal battle against weathering and time proves it. When the dome is finished, the world will end. But the dome will never be finished. The world will continue. The work will go on. This is the true miracle of Cologne Cathedral. Not that it was built, though that is remarkable enough. Not that it survived, though survival against such odds seems almost impossible. The true miracle is that human beings, with our short lives and limited perspectives, our conflicts and our failures, could create and sustain something like this, could commit to a project measured in centuries, could pass our dreams from generation to generation until those dreams became stone and light. Who built Cologne Cathedral? Everyone who contributed. The archbishops who conceived it, the architects who designed it, the workers who raised it, the donors who funded it, the restorers who repaired it, the visitors who venerate it, the craftsmen who maintain it, all of them, across 700 years, participating in a single continuous act of creation. The bones that Reynold carried from Milan still rest behind the high altar. The relics that started everything remain at the heart of everything. Pilgrims still approach, still pray, still believe that something sacred inhabits this space. The shrine glows with gold in the filtered light. The choir stalls bear the carvings of medieval hands. The windows transform sunlight into color. And above it all, the twin spires reach toward heaven. 157 meters of stone and faith. The tallest twin-spired church in the world. The vision that Master Gerhard drew on parchment in the 13th century, realized at last, maintained forever. The cathedral will outlast us all. That is its promise and its challenge. Future generations will inherit what we leave them. They will judge whether we were worthy stewards of what our ancestors created. They will continue the work or let it fall, will honor the tradition or betray it. For now, the work goes on. The stonemasons climb their scaffolding. The glaziers tend their windows. The liturgy sounds in the choir. The pilgrims come. The eternal builders, generation after generation, do what they have always done. They serve something larger than themselves. They build for a future they will never see. That is the lesson of Cologne Cathedral. That is why it matters. That is what those twin spires reaching toward heaven have always meant. When the dome is finished, the world will end. But the dome will never be finished. And so the world continues. And so the work goes on. If you love deep dive history and architecture, hit like and subscribe. Your support lets us chase the archives and keep these sacred stones alive.